Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. We thank you all for coming today, and we're really pleased to have Hal Wingo with us today. And Hal is going to tell you the inside scoop on People magazine, some Life magazine stories. And I was telling Hal as we were chatting in the back, just getting prepped to come up here, I started this so-called career in 1972 in Passaic, New Jersey. Can't somebody just say, yay, Passaic? Half of them are from Passaic, New Jersey, which you've never heard of. A most interesting, urban, gritty, kind of crumbling place. But it was an awful lot of fun to start there. We had a main library in 4 branches. And as I was telling Hal, when People magazine came out, circa 1974, the year my son was born, we figured, well, let's buy a copy for each of the branches. It's new. People are interested in people. Looks celebrity-oriented, politically oriented in terms of politicians. Wow. Well, we had a theft problem immediately. We had a slicing it up problem immediately, and we had to put it in a plastic binder, get 2 copies per branch, then 3 copies per branch. We hid them. We couldn't keep it in-house. It was that popular. And I think we should credit Hal Wingo for that. So please give a great Rancho Mirage welcome to Hal Wingo.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Right off the top, I have to tell you what an honor it is to be involved in any way with the programs of this library. It's amazing, remarkable library. Yeah. Paul and I were sadly unaware of this place when we moved to the desert about 3.5 years ago, but it's been one of our happiest discoveries since we got here. Every Humphrey Bogart fan knows that the real treasure of the Sierra Madre was gold. We know that the real treasure of the Coachella Valley is this fabulous place. And long may it flourish in spite of this little errant detour today. I feel a bit like a journalistic dinosaur from the distant past this afternoon, from the Lucian past. That wouldn't be the Jurassic period, it would have been the period of Henry Luce. The founding genius of Time, Life, Fortune, Sports Illustrated, Money, and People. Generic words that have had a real role to play in American magazine experience. The company Henry Luce created is now gone. Hence the dinosaur exhibit. Just a couple of months ago, Meredith Publishing Company in Des Moines, Iowa, succeeded in its long search to buy Time Incorporated. And the first press release that came out from that company was that Time Incorporated no longer exists. In their dreams. Though Meredith did say it may kill off a few titles or sell some as it puts all of its holdings together. Time magazine may be the first one to go. And frankly, I'd rather see it be given a decent burial than to be sold to some other publisher who would further degrade its editorial worthiness in the terrible manner that's happened to Newsweek magazine. But like it or not, the printed word is in serious decline. We have to admit that. We won't live to see history's ultimate verdict on the full effect of the digital internet age. But the verdict is already in, and it's showing its powerful head. The good news about this library is that reading paper versus electronic books is on the rise. Doesn't that make you want to feel a little smug? Go ahead, feel smug among yourselves. That's great. But at the same time, don't kid yourself. We are drowning in a tsunami of digital gigabytes. And this is just the threshold of what is yet to come. Maybe you saw the story in the New York Times recently about a performance in New York City given by Maria Callas. Not an actress playing Maria Callas, but the real Maria Callas, with her glorious voice, and a hologram projection of herself that was so real, some people wanted to stick knives in it to make sure it was what they thought it might be. She sang in her own glorious voice and had a guest on, Roy Orbison, who hadn't been seen breathing for the last 30 years. The whole thing was just a triumph of holograms. This performance was a mere taste of a much larger program to come later in the year, presented where else but in Tokyo. And it makes you wonder, well, what will be next? Maybe an evening at the theater with Abraham Lincoln, hopefully with a better second act. Or maybe an invitation to tea at Buckingham Palace with Queen Victoria, in which case we would be able to see how much plainer she was than that good-looking actress playing her part now on PBS. The point of all this wizardry is that we cannot deny the digital possibilities of the future. Now, before we all need a Valium to get our heads around that, let me lower your expectations. And for a few minutes, deal not with what is to come, but in what has already been. And given the identity of my career, I hope you will permit me one comment on the subject of American journalism, which has been much maligned over the past couple of years. I know I was not invited here today to say anything political, and I won't. But I will say this, because I think it transcends politics. In a free American democracy, which is the experiment in governance we've been working on for 242 years, it is manifestly, legally, economically impossible for the press to ever be the enemy of the people. Anyone saying that is just channeling the mouth and mind of despots like Stalin and Hitler and tin-horn dictators all over the world. There is no place, thank you. There's simply no place in the American discourse for that kind of nonsense, and it must be called out. Okay, climbing down off my soapbox now. Back to earth. I know you did not come here to attend a wake over dying magazines today, and we won't do that. So let's have some fun instead, and let me wallow for a few moments in some cherished memories from 33 years of work at America's two most successful magazines. I use the word successful in a quantitative sense simply because, at their height, Life and People were the most profitable magazines in publishing history. When Life debuted in 1936, it was the only comprehensive visual record of the world in which we lived. Life was the internet of visual communication long before there was such a word as internet. Now, I know it's not a perfect comparison, but it does help appreciate what the magazine did so very well for so very long. And if it even needs to be said, for the 37 years of its weekly existence, to be featured on the cover of Life magazine was just about the highest journalistic honor that could come to anyone. It meant that out of the entire world's population, about 40 people a year, Life didn't put a person on the cover every week. That person that was there had reached the pinnacle. And I don't know about everyone here today, but I do know one person here who has been exalted on Life's cover. And it was in recognition of her dazzling performance in an experimental new musical on Broadway. Doesn't that have shades of Hamilton? That sounded like something people hadn't heard before. The musical was called Golden Apple, and that person was my dear friend, Kay Ballard. Kay was only the second person photographed for Life by the preeminent portrait photographer of the day, Richard Avedon. And that little factoid is one of the pleasures contained in a soon-to-be-seen documentary about Kay's remarkable career in music and comedy, spanning everything from vaudeville to cabaret to stage, screen, and television. The documentary will have its premiere at the Camelot Theater, so make a mental note to be on the lookout for it.
Thank you, Hal.
Now, that's enough talk about Kay. Let's talk about me. Just kidding, Kay. You know I'd much rather talk about you. After Life's weekly departure, I say weekly departure, I joined the company's magazine development group, which was desperate to prove after that embarrassing end of Life as a weekly, to produce a magazine again that Time Inc. knew how to produce and would draw an audience. It wasn't just a matter of a challenge to create a magazine people would respond to. It was to create a magazine that would attract a huge audience. Time Inc.'s culture required that magazines it produced had to draw an average of 1 million readers per issue. And that had not happened in the United States for 20 years when Time Inc. first created Sports Illustrated. After studying all kinds of ideas for new possible magazines, we were told one day by the corporate offices on the 34th floor, we called it corporate heaven, to see what we could pull together about personalities in a week from available stuff that's already out there, put it in a book and send it up to them. So we did that. They said, that's pretty interesting, try it again next week. So we did that. They said, that's pretty interesting, try it again next week. So we did that, and they said, wait a minute, print one. And we actually put together a test issue that was sold in 10 markets around the country, selected purely for demographic reasons, commercial, social, economic, educational, all the rest. And on the basis of that, Time Inc. launched People Weekly on March 4th, 1974. I thought that was nice because my birthday is March 4th. Not the 1974 part, but the March 4 part. Henry Luce used to delight telling audiences, Time did not invent stories about the people. He said the Bible did that. So we know how well that sold, and why not create a whole magazine along that same idea? Now that is the only time you will ever hear the Bible equated with People Weekly. And it was created strictly with newsstand sales only, not depending on advertisers anymore. It had to be carrying its own weight every week. The problem with that was that you had to put somebody on the cover every week that people would react to in a hurry. Studies were done which showed that within 4 seconds of looking at a cover, people decided to buy it or not buy it. Now, where in the world would you come up with faces like that would draw a huge crowd? Dick Stolley, as I mentioned, came up with a guideline for covers, which came to be known as Stolley's Law. Young sells better than old. Pretty sells better than ugly. Movies sell better than television. Television sells better than sports. And anything sells better than politics. Not now. What had he forgotten? The dead. We never believed it was our franchise to do stories on dead people. And when Elvis Presley died in August of 1977, we didn't put him on the cover. Pretty quickly found out what a big mistake that was. And for the next 8 or 9, it may have been 10 years, on the anniversary of his death, Elvis was on the cover. And it was a huge seller. Clearly, Elvis has not left the building. The first cover on People was Mia Farrow as Daisy Buchanan in the film adaptation of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now remember that if you're ever on Jeopardy. The second cover broke every one of Stolley's laws, but we did it deliberately to try and suggest the breadth that would be available in the magazine as people came to know more about it. There was a woman named Martha Mitchell. I hear you. The estranged and dangerously loquacious wife of John Mitchell, Richard Nixon's Attorney General, and later chairman of the CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. Does the word Watergate sound familiar? Martha couldn't stop herself from going on and on and on to anybody who would listen about everything she had seen John do or heard that had happened between him and his cronies. So we put her on the cover. It didn't sell that well, but it certainly made our point. I think if Twitter had been around in Martha's day, she would have made Donald Trump look like a rank amateur. But wait, never mind. People started at 35 cents a copy. And the first time we raised the price, we thought, well, we better play this safe. So we put Paul Newman on the cover. Ka-ching! That worked. When we raised the price again, we put Paul Newman and his wife Joanne Woodward on the cover. Ka-ching again. We weren't stupid. About that time, we got a note from Newman saying, the next time you raise the price, let us know and we'll round up the children. We didn't do that, but we probably should have. Now, that's a too long introduction for what I came here today to talk to you about. The appeal of journalism to me has always been the opportunity it provided to sit just close enough to the stage of world events and observe at close range what's going on. Close enough, as it were, to smell the grease paint without having to feel the heat of the footlights. It's the best seat in the house. And that's why I loved so much what I did for so long. I had a sister who, for 30 years, taught English to students at schools in Beirut, Lebanon, and Gaza City in occupied Palestine. Her favorite author in the Middle East during all those years was the novelist and poet Khalil Gibran. There's a line from one of his poems that served as her mantra and our mantra for all the years that we were so distantly removed from each other. And that line says, remembrance is a form of meeting. And I think that's true. If you invite some person, some event back into your life through memory, you acquaint yourself with that person and that event again, and you, in one sense, get to live it again. And so today what I want to ask you to do is go with me on a memory journey to some of the places I went and some of the things I saw. If you're up for it, grab your imaginary suitcase, your passport, and maybe just a little Dramamine because there's going to be a lot of flying in the air as we get there. Our first stop has to be Washington, D.C. Where else? On a cold day in November 1963. I'm confident that every person in this room of a certain age, and most people in this room are of a certain age, let's face it, can remember exactly where you were and exactly what you were doing when you heard that John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Am I right about that? Okay. If you were born, say, after 1950, you'll have to get yours out of history books or maybe old copies of Life magazine or even out of a few bad movies. Walk with me up 6th Avenue as I was coming back from lunch on that cold November day to the Time and Life building, which stood just across the street from Radio City Music Hall. That part of 6th Avenue in the 40s during that time was made up mostly of little two-story electronic gadget shops, one after another next to each other, selling everything from recorders to cameras to tape recorders, tape recorders, and small television sets. I never paid any attention to any of those stores. But that day when I was walking back up the street, I saw clusters of people in front of the windows of those stores. And I walked up close to one of them, and I heard somebody say, Kennedy has been shot in Dallas. I flew the next 2 blocks back to the Time and Life building, and as soon as I got into my office, I was told, you're on the 4 o'clock shuttle to Washington. No time to pick up a suitcase, toothbrush, anything else. Call your family and tell them you're on your way. I got to Washington about 5 o'clock, went into our bureau about 6 blocks from the White House. Already there were about 20 photographers and reporters there. We were all getting assignments. I was told I was to be that night at the White House when Mrs. Kennedy returned from Dallas. We didn't know what time she was to come in, so we just parked ourselves over there about 8 o'clock and waited, not knowing when it was that she might come. She got there, I think, about 11 o'clock at night. Now, the north portico of the White House is the one that's covered, where cars can drive under it, and it's where people come and go who are dignitaries coming in and out of the White House. You can do that by getting out of a car on the passenger side and walking in the White House and basically not be seen. There were a crowd of at least 30 photographers on the driveway with Bob and with me. And when her car pulled in, we thought, well, we're going to miss this. It stopped about 30 feet shy of the covered entrance. We hadn't thought she might do that until we realized that this First Lady understood perfectly every moment of history she was living and which she was creating. When she stepped out of the car, there she was in her blood-stained pink suit. It seemed like minutes, but she really only stood there for a few seconds, just staring at all the cameras flashing lights at her. She then went in the house, and we found out later that she had said to those who asked her to change her clothing before she came back to Washington, "No, I want them to see what they did." And it was another photo opportunity she gave us when she stepped out of the car. We learned later she spent the entire night going over all the preparations for Abraham Lincoln's funeral and tried to copy that in every way that she could. That pink suit, on Rose Kennedy's instructions, was sent to the National Archive building in Maryland, where it stays to this day, locked in an acid-free container. Technically, it belonged to Caroline Kennedy, but in 2003, she deeded the suit to the government on the condition that it never be shown publicly for another 100 years. Who knows how that will all play out? That was the first of many images that are seared into my mind as clearly today as they were on the day they happened. Others included the procession of the casket from the White House up to the Capitol building for lying in state. And as I walked in fairly close proximity to it down Constitution Avenue, and thousands of people were behind barricades on both sides, I saw a lot of people with little transistor radios up to their ears like this, and somebody finally said, "Oswald's been shot in Dallas." You could hear a moan go all through that crowd. Not for Oswald, but for the remembrance and the shock again of what we were doing to ourselves as a nation. Then there was the Monday morning progression from the White House to the cathedral for the funeral mass for John Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy came out of the White House on the arm of her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, followed by the White House staff and assembled government people, and then the largest assemblage of heads of state ever gathered at the funeral of a head of state. The one image that stuck in my mind was the sight of Charles de Gaulle and Haile Selassie. They were in lockstep with each other down the street like this. I'll never understand why they paired those two people together, but there you are. In any case, after the funeral, the following procession was across the Arlington Bridge to the Arlington National Cemetery for the president's interment at the Eternal Flame. And I was stationed, no, we were stationed because we're there, right? Just above all of this, up a hill with a perfect view looking down over the burial area, across the bridge toward the Johnson, that's coming next, to the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials on the other side, as night began to fall. And as night began to fall, still no one had seen what happened in Dallas. Only one person with a little 9mm movie camera got the pictures that showed what the actual act was like. In this age of instant photography where every person, every one of you with a smartphone is a photographer, can you imagine something as isolated as capturing a scene like that by only one person? Never in our history again will there ever be anything to equal that kind of isolation of photographic opportunity. Now, it may be worth sharing just how life happened to get that film. I'll tell that quickly. Dick Stolley, who I mentioned earlier, was the Life Bureau Chief in the Beverly Hills office for Life at that time. And when he got the call, this story has a Rancho Mirage connection, by the way. When he got the call to jump on the next plane and get to Dallas, he grabbed the two photographers who were in the office at that time. One of them was Don Cravens, later to become the husband of Peggy Cravens. And of course, they were benefactors to so many charitable organizations and so forth in this desert, which has made a real significance. When Dick got to Dallas, there were just kind of vague rumors about this guy whose name may be Zapper or Zapruder or who knows what he was, but he was believed to have actually shot some footage. So reverting to reporting 101, Dick picked up white pages of a telephone book, flipped through to disease, see if he found anything that sounded like that word, Zapruder. Good thing he wasn't having to go through the Smiths. But there was only one. When he got to it, Zapruder Abraham. He started calling, no answer. That was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He called every 5 minutes for the next 4 hours. And at 8 o'clock, Mr. Zapruder answered the phone. He said, "I'm Dick Stolley from Life magazine. I'd like to come out and talk to you about the film you have." He was very upset that night. He said, "I can't do it, I can't do it." Finally, he said, "Okay, you can come around tomorrow morning, but don't come before 9. Dick was there at 8. But not to get in. He waited patiently outside until Mr. Zapruder saw him and then came and welcomed him to come in. As soon as Dick got inside, a horde of press reps were starting to descend on the house, screaming and shouting, "Let us in, you've got to let us see what you've got. This isn't fair, we need to know exactly what happened," and all that sort of thing. All the while, Dick and Mr. Zapruder were just making a little agreement inside, by which Life agreed to pay him $50,000 for first publication rights of those pictures. Dick knew the only safe way out of that was out the back door of that house, which he did and headed for the airport with history in his hands. A few days later, he went back to the house to further negotiate a little understanding with Mr. Zapruder about the use of the film. And Mr. Zapruder's business partner was there, and he happened to say to Dick, "Do you know why Life got these pictures?" And Dick said, "Well, it was a lot of money, and it was Life magazine." He said, "Nope, nothing of the kind." He said, "Throughout this whole process, when all those people out there were going crazy, shouting and demanding and everything else, you behaved like a perfect gentleman." And Mr. Zapruder was confident that these pictures would not be exploited in any unfair way by Life, and he felt comfortable with your having the film. Okay, go tell your children and your grandchildren and your nieces and your nephews that there is historical proof good manners pay off, right? All right, now Johnson is president. So we got to jump in the airplane again and go this time to Austin, Texas for his first trip home 4 weeks after the assassination as President of the United States to spend his time at the ranch. I was part of the press pool at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin to be there just in case anything happened that required press response. There were about 8 or 9 of us in this group. I represented all magazines, somebody else represented all wire services, so forth, that kind of thing. Basically, it was boring. We just sat around playing cards or whatever because we didn't feel we could leave and go anywhere, and nothing was really going on. Until we got a call on New Year's Eve that President Johnson was coming in and he wanted to say hello to us. So we gathered about 10:30 in the bar of the Driscoll Hotel, and in he came. We sat in about in a half circle, and he was sort of in front of us all. And he went on and on about how terribly he felt that he had to secure John Kennedy's legacy and didn't want anything more than to make sure that everything he believed in and wanted was done. This from a man who never had a kind word to say about John Kennedy in private, ever. And then just before he was through, and he was saying, of course, I need you, you guys have to help me. I can't do this without you. He leaned in, grabbed me by the knee with his hand right here and said, "Now, boys, let me tell you something. While I'm in the White House, you may see me coming in and out of a few women's bedrooms. Just remember, that's none of your business. We looked at each other. Then he says, Happy New Year, good night, and he was gone. It took us a little while to realize what had happened. We knew he had then come in to see us to lay down the rules. All he was trying to say to us is, I want you to give me the same cover you gave John Kennedy. And all that can be said about that is that after Watergate, giving the president a pass on personal behavior was gone for good. At least we thought at the time. One more Johnson story. This time we have to fly to Roswell, New Mexico. Johnson had picked Western artist Peter Hurd to paint his official portrait, which would eventually one day hang in the White House. Peter was very flattered and pleased by all of this until all of the conditions began coming in. No sittings. You can only work from photographs the White House sends you, and that's it. Peter said, I don't do portraits that way. I can't do a portrait that way, so I'll have to back out. Well, after a fair amount of grumbling, they said, okay, we'll give you one 45-minute session with Johnson. At that session, Johnson spent most of the time asleep in the chair. And at the end, when he got up, he demanded to see what it was, and he walked over to it and looked at it and said, it looks like an old drunk. All right. There was, I think, one more session at the ranch that he was able to sneak in. And then Peter had done what he could with the painting and was finished. He was instructed by the White House to have it created and sent to the ranch. Peter agreed only on condition that it not be opened until he got there and could set it up in the right light for the best possible effect. You know what happened. When they got there, Henrietta Wyeth Hurd, Peter's wife, was the sister of Andrew Wyeth. And she, in her own right, was a very well-known portraitist of children. So anyway, they were back at the ranch, and they were summoned up to the office. They walk in there, and Peter saw the painting on the wall, uncrated, under strong fluorescent lights, and in words which Peter later described to me, as light, as subtle as the men's room at Washington's Union Station. I thought that was funny. But it broke his heart when he saw it. And before he could say a word, Johnson uttered the words that were heard round the world. It's the ugliest thing I ever saw. That was the headline. That's what got me on a plane from Los Angeles to Roswell to go talk to Peter about what had gone so horribly wrong. Peter was just stunned by this response from the president. And he said, Mr. President, I'm sorry you feel that way. What kind of work do you like? Johnson said, I'll show you what I like, and went over to the wall and picked up a small piece of work by Norman Rockwell. Showed it to him and said, he did this in one day and without any sittings. Peter was a funny guy. He had a great sense of humor. But humor had long gone out of this situation. So he said, Mr. President, not if Norman Rockwell had 4 pairs of hands could he have done that work in one day. And the situation just got colder and colder in the room. The only people there were Lady Bird and several staffers for President Johnson. But finally, Henrietta couldn't take it anymore. Now, she was pretty badly crippled with arthritis, always walked with a cane. But she got up out of her chair, walked across the room, picked up that cane and slammed it down right on the desk in front of the president and said, Mr. President, you don't know a thing about art. This is very, very good work. Johnson didn't say a word. At that point, they realized they weren't going anywhere with this, so they decided they had to leave, and they picked themselves up and said, please create the painting and send it back to us, which they agreed to do. A few days later, Lady Bird called Peter and Henrietta and said, not if I live to be 1,000 years old, would I ever expect to have a day as hard as that one was. Lady Bird spent a lot of her life pouring oil on Lyndon troubled waters, for sure. The painting itself finally ended up in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. And its backstory makes it one of the most sought-after paintings in the whole exhibit. Okay, that's enough, Johnson. Fly with me now. Let's go north to Alaska. In the late 60s, mid-60s, Life decided to do a major feature on the two new states, Alaska and Hawaii. I had the privilege of going with a wonderful photographer named Ralph Crane up to Alaska, and they said, just go up there, stay as long as you need, come back with a story on what makes this place so special. Well, I'm sure some of you know how special Alaska can be visually. It's just an amazing place. Everywhere you turn, there were great images, and also really interesting people. The mayor at the time of Fairbanks was a man who had spent time in the penitentiary for white-collar crimes. In Alaska, so many people could go and have a second chance at life to correct mistakes that they had made in the lower 48. Even when we went to one of the lumber camps, there were 2 or 3 lumberjacks. When Rudy started taking pictures, said, don't take my picture, I'm wanted for child support in 3 states. You know, don't show my face. There was enough of that. The one picture that Rudy really wanted most to shoot involved a pulp mill outside of Ketchikan in the southern part of the state. What he saw there was a lake in front of the state full of logs jammed up against each other that were fed into that mill every day and turned into wood pulp for products sold all over the world. Rudy had a way of looking at great images and finding a way to improve on them. So what his idea was to shoot a double exposure on one of those big old speed graphic cameras that would show the logs in the water in the foreground by day and then come back at night and show it with the beautiful plumes of white steam coming out of the smokestacks. And that would be the only thing in the night frame. So in the picture that Rudy had in mind, you'd see all of these logs in front of you and then the wonderful steam coming out. As we walked down a trail to get to the water and mount the camera, we passed one little cabin, very deserted area, with a prospector sitting out on the porch. We just nodded at him and went on down, mounted the camera on the tripod. On the way back, we stopped and said, now we've left a camera on a tripod down there, but it cannot be moved or we won't get a picture. Please be sure that that doesn't get touched. He just nodded at us, and we went on into town for dinner waiting for darkness, which in Alaska at that time meant about 10 o'clock at night. Drove back out there and started down that trail again, and everything looked a little bit different. We couldn't find that camera. We couldn't find anything. We thought, what? And then we heard this prospector walking down the trail behind us. He walked up and he said, did you boys figure the tide? Tide? We thought that water was a lake fed by rivers. It turned out it was an inlet of the Pacific Ocean. That tripod and that camera were this far underwater at that time. And the old prospector said, you told me not to touch it, and I didn't. He probably sat there and watched it go under. Anyway, we told him, don't worry, not your fault. We'll be back after the tide goes down in the morning, pick it up, and so forth. When we came back the next morning, he had a barrel of sweet water on his porch and was dipping that camera in and out of that water, hoping to salvage it. Of course, it's beyond salvaging. Rudy called New York and told him what had happened, and everybody laughed. And they said, we'll send out another camera. But they were so amused about our nautical naivete that they made the editor's note in the magazine the next week, these 2 crazy people in Alaska who couldn't detect a river from the ocean. Anyway, now I regret to tell you, we must fly again. See how this works? We're always in the air, going somewhere. We have to fly now to the dark of the American South during the civil rights struggles in the 1960s. It was tough being a journalist covering all that was happening in the South during that period of time, but it was even tougher being a representative of Life magazine. With its large page format and double-page spreads, Life forced America to look at what was going on. Attack dogs biting demonstrators, nightsticks used to beat people, churches being bombed, and the death of young children and blinding of others. Those were pictures that you just couldn't walk away from. And as a consequence, Life became the most hated journal in the South. Now, I was thrown into this fine mess when 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, were working that summer on a program to try to encourage African Americans to register to vote. That was the whole point of the Freedom Summer Campaign. Chaney was an African American. The other 2 were white boys from New York. So the idea was that maybe I could go there and find something out, because at that time, 18 men had been arrested for complicity in that murder, in those murders, including the sheriff, the deputy sheriff, an itinerant Baptist preacher who doubled as the local recruiter for the Klan. I got to Mississippi in Meridian, rented a Hertz car, drove right up to Philadelphia, Mississippi. And as I think some of you probably know, in the South, the courthouse in these southern towns sits right in the middle of a 1-block square, right in the heart of town, so it's never any problem to find it. Philadelphia was a small town anyway. I got there, drove around the courthouse, parked on the north side, head into the curb, got out, walked into the building, up the stairs to the 2nd floor to the office of the Justice of the Peace. When I walked in and said, "I'm Hal Wingo from up," he put his hand up, stood up and said, "Young man, let me give you some advice. You close that notebook, you go down those steps, you walk out of this building, you get in your car, and don't ever come back to this town again." Now, there are 2 ways of looking at that. He could have been genuinely concerned about my safety, because not too long before, 3 young men had spent their last night in that very building, in that jail. The other possibility was that he was looking out for himself as a co-conspirator for these murderers. Let's see which one of those is most likely true. I did what he said. I walked down the steps, closed my notebook, walked out, got in the car, backed out, went around the building to the south side for the road leading to Meridian. It wasn't until then, as I looked back at the courthouse, that I saw the justice standing at the top of the steps. He had followed me down the steps, watched which car I got into, and was on the south side pointing out my car to 4 men standing around him on those steps. I spent 3 years in Vietnam, and I can tell you honestly, I was never more uncertain about my life than I was right there in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. I went back to Meridian, changed the car for another one, came right back to Philadelphia, and spent the next 2 days getting doors slammed in my face by people who were literally frightened out of their wits and afraid to talk about anything or anyone, except for one person, a woman. Her name was Florence Mars. She was from a very prominent, wealthy family in Philadelphia. And she, in her heart, had decided what was happening in this campaign through the South was really wrong. And she became active in support of all of these programs, encouraging these people to go register to vote. So she alone was able to convince her pastor at the First Methodist Church to hold a memorial service for those 3 young men, and later wrote a wonderful book about it called Witness at Philadelphia. Now, about 6 weeks ago, that preacher Klansman I referred to, a man named James Ray Killen, died at age 92 in the notorious Parchman prison in Mississippi. He was convicted in 2005, 38 years after the event, and was serving time in the prison when he died. The Parchman officials said that the cause of his death was congestive heart failure and extensive hypertension. You think? Wow. Can you imagine anyone getting the nomination of his party for president of the United States and then choosing to begin his national campaign for the presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi? That's exactly what Ronald Reagan did in 1980, complete with his familiar chant that the government is not the answer to your problems, government itself is the problem. if there was ever a dog whistle to extreme racists, that was one. Now, I knew Ronald Reagan quite well, and I had considered him a friend of sorts, but that was totally a tone-deaf moment on his part. We've done that. Now we have to head east, really east. This is going to be a long flight. Get out your Dramamine. We're going from Palm Springs to Saigon, another dark part of the world. I have only two emotions when I think about Vietnam: sadness and anger. And what remains to be said about Vietnam? One of the great sadnesses for me is the 58,318 American men and women who lost their lives to no honorable purpose and whose names are on that wall in Washington, the memorial. It is at least a remembrance to them. At the same time, it speaks to the arrogance of angry, old white men who sent them to Vietnam to die while lying to the American people about what was being accomplished in the name of American security. I also feel great sadness for the many, many more Vietnamese men and women and children who died in that conflict for so long. You may have seen the Ken Burns Pbs on Vietnam last year, it was 8 or 9 part or something like that. I think the greatest contribution of that documentary is its insistence that we not forget the most significant fact that the Vietnamese paid a huge price in human life for America's intervention for more than a decade. Both Johnson and Nixon bragged about fighting communism in Vietnam so we won't have to fight them in this country. Really? Did the Vietnamese get a choice in that vote? I saw plenty of evidence of the cost in human life paid by the Vietnamese, none more so at a little hamlet called My Lai, probably not a lot bigger than this room, in which American troops walked through one day, killed every man, woman, child, and animal on the suspicion that they had harbored Viet Cong while they were passing through the area. That story was uncovered by a journalist named Seymour Hersh. And sometime after all of that, I went to My Lai to try and talk to people there and get some sense from them of what it was like for them. Their stories haunted me for a long time, and I hope it haunted some of the readers of Life. I feel anger about Vietnam because it did not have to be. The blame for our presence there goes back further than Nixon and Johnson. Kennedy started the program of advisors and consultants there. And while all of his associates would say, had he been reelected in 1974, he would have pulled out. I wish that he might have done that if he had lived. I don't know that he would have, and we will never know. Talk is easy when history cannot be changed. And then when I think about Vietnam, I think about a profound little book written by the insightful American historian Barbara Tuchman. The book is called The March of Folly, in which she very precisely spells out how nations throughout history have acted against their own self-interest in starting and extending wars they should never have been involved with. Vietnam was her quintessential example in the book of how things went so wrong. When I read her book, I thought, why couldn't she have been president? When we were getting sucked into this quagmire. When I read her book, I thought, why couldn't she have been? And then I thought, oh yeah, she's a woman. Extrapolating from Tuchman, who is unfortunately gone, I was thinking, how much worse could it have been for a woman to have been in charge when all these terrible things were happening that men couldn't somehow get worked out any better? Do you think we will ever know in this country what female sensibility might have to offer in dealing with problems a lot of men cannot seem to conquer and solve other than by force? This is no call for Hillary to get back in the game, but I, for one, will be happy when women rise to prominence, not just in Hollywood, but in the seats of power in this country. I see some women clapping. All right, okay. And if that makes me a feminist, so be it. Okay, last story. How bad am I? Last story, promise. And that's the best news of the day, isn't it? Go with me for a meeting with the person I would call the most celebrated American of the 20th century. It happened in 1970, before I left Hong Kong to come back to the States, Paul and our children. I flew down to Manila and then out to the little island of Mindanao to meet with a young man named Manuel Elizalde, who came from a very prominent and wealthy family in Manila, but had turned his back on all that to commit himself to the work of trying to protect the native population at that time back in the forests of that island, who were believed to be the most primitive people left on earth. I got to Mindanao, took a little chartered flight over to Elizalde's base camp, which was really nothing more than a clearing among the trees with one building for food and administration and then little huts all around for his staff, about 15 to sleep in. And when I got there, he said, we got another visitor here who's very interested in our work, and let me introduce you to him. Here's Charles Lindbergh. Boing. At that point, I immediately lost interest in Elizalde. What a remarkable, remarkable man. We spent the afternoon together hearing what work was going on with Elizalde and so forth as I tried to feign interest. And, of course, everyone knows of the great triumph of Lindbergh's life, flying solo, nonstop from Paris to New York, the first person to do it. He also had a great tragedy in his life, was the kidnapping and murder of his firstborn child. After we ate dinner in the dining hall, we were escorted over to one little cabin, and Manuel said, you and Charles will be sleeping in here. I thought, I'm spending the night with Charles Lindbergh. How cool is that? We walked in, and the room had this in it: one army cot, one bedroll, no lights, no bath. Took me about a New York nanosecond to figure out how to handle that one. I said, I'm fine, I'll be right here on the bedroll, you take the cot. Oh, no, I'll take the bedroll, you take the cot. Oh, no, I'm taking the bedroll, you take the cot. He said, I prefer the bedroll. And if you don't want the cot, we'll both sleep in the bedroll. Well, let the record reflect, I slept fitfully in the cot while this hero to the world slept on the floor. When I woke in the morning, he sat cross-legged on the floor, shining my shoes. He said, I polish my shoes every day, don't you? I tried not to answer. A little bit later, we jumped in a helicopter and flew about another 10 minutes into the forest, at which point we actually encountered and had a meeting with some of the Tassay native population who came out from among the trees and greeted us. And I've got to get something out here to show you. They were tall people, and they were happy people. They had great smiles on their faces and made the funniest noise. I don't know what they were saying. But they wanted to stroke Lindbergh's mane of white hair. I actually had hair on my head at that time up there. But his was really full and wonderful. The thing is, they brought us gifts. We didn't take them anything. So who were the civilized people in this gathering? You just have to wonder. Let me show you what they gave me. This beautifully carved, handsome, well-created wooden and utilitarian knife. I have treasured that all these years from these people. After we had stayed about a half an hour with them, we said, it's time to go. And we went back to the camp, and Elizalde radioed Mindanao Airport to send over a little small plane to pick us up, take us back to Mindanao. Scout's honor. When that plane landed on a little mountaintop runway, just enough to land and take off on, was not a lot of give on either end. The inscription on the side of that plane was the Spirit of St. Louis. That pilot did not know who he was coming to pick up. And when he was introduced to Charles Lindbergh, I thought, we're not getting off this mountaintop alive. He's so excited, he'll crash this thing as sure as the world. But of course he didn't. Here I am. And we got back to Mindanao, and I was a little bit hungry about that point for something I recognized as food. And I said, I'm going to go get something to eat. You want to go? He said, no, no, no. I never waste time in airports. I take care of my correspondence. At which point he pulls out a Parker pen, some white paper from his duffel bag, and says, I'll be right here when you get back. So you go ahead. The terminal was really just a lot of tin-roofed, open, tabernacle-type buildings where hundreds of people were milling around waiting for flights. I was probably not gone more than 30 minutes. And when I got back, I didn't see him. He wasn't there. Now, here is the point where you prepare to gasp. I walked up to him and said, well, I thought you'd been kidnapped and carried off. My favorite earthquake movie was one from the 40s called Green Dolphin Street. When an earthquake occurred in that movie, it didn't just shake the earth. Earth opened up like jaws like this. Houses and cars and people fell in, and then the earth shut. I just hoped that's what would happen at that moment, and I would never have to face him or anybody else again. He couldn't have been more gracious. He said, I just moved to get out of the sun. I'm fine. It's about time for our flight. We flew back to Manila and then on to Hong Kong in what was then a new 707 from Boeing. Lindbergh had served as a consultant in the creation of that plane, and he gave me the full story of it on our flight, how it was the safest plane ever developed because it was the natural progression of aircraft technology, nothing new or experimental about it. Just before we landed in Hong Kong, he turned to me and he said, I'm going to have to say my goodbyes now because I know that the Mandarin Hotel, which was owned by Pan American, which was owned by Pan American owned Intercontinental Hotels, yeah, okay. He said, I know they're going to send a car out to pick me up and try to take me into the hotel. I just can't stand that kind of thing, so I'm going to try to slip by them when we go through customs. Now, he traveled always wearing khaki pants, khaki safari shirt, khaki duffel bag over his back. That was it. And when he walked through customs, he walked right by the man holding up a sign that said Charles Lindbergh. That PR person probably lost his job for losing Charles Lindbergh. Found out later Lindbergh had gone into Kowloon and rented a room over a jewelry store for a stay of 3 or 4 days, away, as he always liked to be, from the clamor of people around him. He died about 6 years later. And my family and I, some time ago, went to the island of Maui, up to the little town of Hana. Anybody ever been there? All right. You know up there there's a little congregational church and a gravesite on the side of the church that has Sam Pryor, his friend from Pan American, 3 of Sam Pryor's monkeys, and a tombstone that reads simply, Charles A. Lindbergh, date and place of birth, date and place of death, and one inscription from a portion of the Psalms which says, if I lift on the wings of angels or descend into the depths of the sea. I don't mind telling you, I shed a few tears. I know that he was a difficult, complicated, controversial man, very much opposed to America's entry into World War II, fierce America firster, much too forgiving and tolerant of Hitler. And we found out after he died he had 2 separate families, secret families in Europe. But he gets a pass in my heart for everything he did, for the way in which he was so gracious and forgiving to me. Okay, that's about all the mental traveling we can do in one day, I think. And I just want to say to you something I learned in my 33 years of doing this. Every person you encounter is an interesting story. They may not always want their stories told, but that's a separate issue. Every one of us is a story worth knowing. And I feel that way. I felt it in Santa Fe. I felt I could go down the street in Santa Fe and scratch people on and say, tell me your story. It'd be great. I can do the same thing here, and I know I could do it in this room. And so I just want to say to you, thank you for letting me share these experiences with you on some places I've been. I appreciate your company. Thank you very much.